In the last years of her life, the doors of the villa at 4 Route du Champ d'Entraînement in the Bois de Boulogne were opened to almost no one. The woman inside had once been the most famous woman in the world, the woman for whom a king gave up his throne, whose wedding present was exile, whose house had been built around the most expensive choice of the 20th century's first half. Now she was in her 80s. She had buried the Duke in 1972, and in the years that followed, one person came to hold more and more of her world in a single pair of hands. Not a relative, she had none who would come. Not a friend, the friends were dying or kept away. A lawyer. Maître Suzanne Blum held the power of attorney. She held the checkbook. She held the visitor list. She held the keys. Possessions began to leave the house. Old friends found they could no longer get in. And the woman who had maintained an absolute silence about her private life for 5 decades discovered that the last thing she owned, the story itself, was no longer entirely hers either. Her name was Wallis Simpson, and her final years belonged to someone else. Before that story can be told, there is a bridge to cross. April 29th, 1986, St. George's Chapel, Windsor Castle. A private service, 28 minutes long. The institution that had spent 50 years refusing to fully acknowledge her had managed, in the end, to find a dean who acknowledged the Duchess of Windsor once, in a prayer. Queen Elizabeth was there, Prince Philip, the Queen Mother, the woman who had fought hardest and longest to keep Wallis outside the family circle, the Prince and Princess of Wales. They carried the Duchess in an English oak coffin with a silver plaque. Wallis, Duchess of Windsor, 1896 to 1986. They buried her at the Royal Burial Ground at Frogmore, Windsor, in the grave beside the Duke she had outlived by 14 years. The story of the butler who had stood at those doors, who had guarded the secrets of that household across decades, ended at that funeral. That was the first half. This is the second, and it's darker. It begins where the butler's story left off, with the death of the Duke in May 1972, and the 14 years that produced that 28-minute service, and the figure who stands at the center of those years. She isn't a royal. She isn't a servant. She isn't a friend. She is the lawyer who held the keys and never gave them back. May 28, 1972. The Duke of Windsor died at 4 Route du Champ d'Entraînement of throat cancer, aged 77. Wallis Simpson was 75. The villa had been their home since the early 1950s, leased from the city of Paris at what multiple sources describe as a peppercorn rent. Some accounts put the annual figure as low as $10. In addition to the nominal rent, the arrangement included free security and exemption from French income tax. It was the kind of tenancy a government extends to permanent, prestigious, and somewhat inconvenient house guests. The terms were generous enough that the Windsors couldn't afford to leave. The house itself was a monument. Stéphane Boudin, president of Maison Janson, the Paris design firm that had also worked for the Élysée Palace and, later, Jackie Kennedy's White House, had overseen every interior decision. Louis XVI furniture, porcelain, paintings that documented 40 years of a social life conducted entirely outside the country that had produced it. And in the drawing room, the desk on which Edward had signed the instrument of abdication on December 10, 1936. The Windsors kept it there, in plain view, for 35 years. Some objects serve as permanent reminders of what they cost. This one cost a crown. After the Duke's death, Wallis flew to London for the funeral, staying at Buckingham Palace at the Queen's invitation. She looked, by all contemporary accounts, devastated and increasingly frail. Then she came back to Paris, to the villa, to the rooms Boudin had designed for a couple, now occupied by one. She was a widow of the most public kind. her grief on display for a world that had spent 4 decades debating whether she was a schemer or a victim and had never quite reached a verdict. She had no children. Her friendships, though genuine and numerous through the marriage years, had been organized around the social calendar of a couple. The sparkling dinner parties attended by European aristocracy, writers, and diplomats, the life described in contemporaneous accounts as brilliant and cosmopolitan, had been joint work. Now the villa was simply a large, expensive, beautifully decorated house in the 16th arrondissement, and the woman inside it was alone. The Duke's financial arrangements had never been renegotiated since the exile began in 1936. What remained was a comfortable but not unlimited income, a house provided by French goodwill that carried no guarantee of continuation, and a woman 75 years old with arteriosclerosis, documented at the time of Edward's death as already contributing to mental confusion, who had not run her own affairs independently for 35 years. She was anxious about money. She was anxious about her health. She was, in the words used across multiple accounts of this period, still intellectually present, but increasingly anxious about her finances and what would happen to the arrangements that kept her life in place. Anxiety about finances is a door. In the months following the Duke's death, a figure was already standing in it. Suzanne Marguerite Blumel was born on November 24, 1898, in Niort-du-Sèvre, a merchant's daughter from Western France, 2 years and 5 months younger than Wallis Simpson. She would outlive her. She was admitted to the bar at Poitiers in 1922, resigned in 1923, and was formally admitted to the Paris bar on January 22, 1924. Her specialty, confirmed in the Musée du Barreau de Paris profile, was described as literary law and private cinematographic law, the legal infrastructure of the entertainment industry, where rights, personalities, and correspondence generate more disputes than any other business. Her clients, listed in the Independent's 1994 obituary of Blum, included Warner Brothers, Universal Pictures, 20th Century Fox, MGM, Charlie Chaplin, Walt Disney, and Rita Hayworth. She handled Hayworth's divorce from Prince Ali Khan. The Warner Brothers case against composer Igor Stravinsky produced one of the most quoted lines in her professional biography. She reportedly reduced his awarded damages from $1 million to 1 franc. She was also a novelist. Under the pseudonym L.S. Caron, she published 3 crime novels. She worked for the French Ministry of Foreign Affairs. During the Second World War, she represented the Free French delegation in the United States and a North Africa committee. By 1977, she held the rank of commandeur in the Légion d'honneur. By 1989, she was Grand Officier of the Ordre National du Mérite. This isn't by any measure a peripheral figure. Before she ever entered Wallis Simpson's story, Blum had spent 50 years becoming one of the most formidably credentialed lawyers in France. She wasn't an opportunist who stumbled into a rich client's orbit. She was a professional of serious standing, whose entry into the Windsor orbit was, in fact, structural from the beginning. In 1934, Suzanne Blum married Paul Weil, the Duke of Windsor's Paris attorney. Through Weil, she entered the Windsor legal sphere 18 years before the Windsors even moved to the Bois de Boulogne. French biographical entries confirm she was handling Edward's legal affairs in France after his abdication and after his move to Paris in 1952. When Weil died in 1965, she inherited the relationship. When Edward died in May 1972, she became executor of his estate. She described her own role, in her own words documented in The Independent, as defender of the moral rights and interests of the Duchess of Windsor. The accumulation of authority was, in The Independent's phrase, gradual, though steady. Before 1978, one account describes her as a zealous, competent lawyer called in when the Duchess had problems. By 1978, something had changed, or become visible. A specific inflection point documented by Vickers falls in the winter of 1972 to 1973. The Duchess had suffered a serious fall over Christmas 1972, fracturing her hip and requiring surgery. During her hospitalization, Sir Godfrey Morley of Allen and Overy, the honorable English solicitor who had represented the Windsor interests through decades of negotiation with the British royal family, including the delicate arrangements around burial at Frogmore, was dismissed from his position. In a shaky hand, from her hospital bed, Wallis signed Sir Godfrey away. Vickers documents this in the updated foreword to the 2026 edition of Behind Closed Doors. It was while the Duchess was in hospital with a broken hip that Blum effected this coup. She delivered herself, the account argues, into the hands of her French lawyer. Whether this was a fully informed and voluntary act by a competent woman who had made a deliberate decision about her legal representation, or something more troubling, is precisely what the record can't confirm. What it confirms is the outcome. Sir Godfrey was gone, and Blum's practical authority was now uncontested. The most contested factual question in the entire story is whether Blum held formal power of attorney over the Duchess. Multiple sources assert she exercised it. The dates given for when it was formally granted range from 1973, in one Vanity Fair account, to 1976 in Blackwood's book summary, to October 1977 in a Daily Mail account of Vickers's research that describes Blum securing total power of attorney by deception, obtaining the Duchess's verbal assent through a clerk. The specific legal document has never been publicly produced. The Independent's obituary stated the matter with precision that should be quoted directly. Blum was frequently challenged to give evidence of the Duchess's wish and to show that she had a power of attorney to act for her. Blum published virtually everything except that authority. Vickers, in Behind Closed Doors, alleges the power of attorney may have been obtained through a forged letter. This is an attributed allegation, not an adjudicated fact. Blum died in January 1994, 17 years before Vickers's book appeared in 2011. She couldn't respond, and no formal legal rebuttal has ever been published. Not by her estate, not by the Pasteur Institute, not by anyone with standing to contest the account. What is documented rather than disputed is what Blum controlled in practice. She controlled access to the Duchess. Around 1980, Lord Snowdon attempted to photograph the Duchess and was refused entry. Diana Moseley, the long-term Paris neighbor and friend who published her own biography of Wallis that same year, confirmed to journalist Caroline Blackwood that the Duchess's old friends had not seen her for several years despite trying, because Blum blocked visits. The Right Reverend James Leo of the American Cathedral in Paris was one of the rare figures the record shows Blum permitted to see Wallis in her final years. Almost no independent social visitor gained access after approximately 1980. She controlled the archive. In 1979, Blum hired Michael Bloch, Cambridge-educated, called to the bar by the Inner Temple in 1978, as her assistant. The New Yorker noted in 1991 that she gave him full and exclusive access to the Windsor archive to, in the magazine's framing, present the case for the defense. Bloch wrote 6 books about the Duke and Duchess of Windsor between 1983 and 1996, including editions of Windsor documents and correspondence. Every one was shaped by what Blum chose to make available, because every one was built from the archive she controlled. She controlled specific possessions. The Penguin sample edition of Vickers's Behind Closed Doors carries a caption beneath the Cecil Beaton photograph of the Duchess taken in 1971, one of the last formal portraits before her visible decline, that identifies the ring the Duchess is wearing. It's described as the jonquil diamond ring sold, without her knowledge, to Estee Lauder on August 30th, 1977, for $150,000. The authority under which it was sold, Maître Blum. Vickers also documents, across the 462 pages of Behind Closed Doors, allegations that Blum systematically dismissed the Duchess's long-serving English household staff, the chef, the chauffeur, the hairdresser, replacing them with people of her choosing. He alleges items were sold to Blum's own acquaintances at below market value. He alleges codicils to the Duchess's will directed significant pieces to French museums in gratitude for providing the house on the Bois, and that Blum's advancement in the Légion d'honneur ran parallel to these arrangements. He alleges that a lawyer and a doctor who came to the villa to help the Duchess revise her will near the end of her life were refused entry. These are Vickers's allegations. They haven't been adjudicated. The Times literary supplement described them as detailed, horrible, and convincing. The Guardian found the book stylistically over-detailed in places, yogurt orders, monogrammed linens, but didn't challenge the sourcing or access that underpinned the central claims. The Telegraph called it an accumulation of evidence against Blum. The slightly foxed Quarterly, reviewing the book, described the drama as arising from the criminal exploitation of a sick woman after the death of her husband. That last phrase is the review's language, not a legal finding. Vickers, for full context, isn't a tabloid figure. His major biographies include Queen Elizabeth, the Queen Mother, Cecil Beaton, Vivian Leigh, Alice, Princess Andrew of Greece, and Greta Garbo. The Financial Times described him as the most knowledgeable royal biographer on the planet. The Literary Review notes that at age 12, when his peers were following the Beatles, Vickers was already a dedicated student of the Windsors. Behind Closed Doors draws on nearly 40 years of his own diary entries, previously unpublished papers, and testimony from the Duchess's own staff. He is specific, credentialed, and documented. He is also the only account we have, and the epigraph he chose for his book is worth registering. It's a fragment of a letter Suzanne Blum wrote in September 1943 when she was in New York and had no connection to the Windsors whatsoever. She wrote, "The best way to keep someone as a prisoner is to surround him with love, affection, and friendship." Vickers chose that line to open his book. The selection speaks for itself, though the selection is his. The counter-argument must be stated, because the evidence requires it and intellectual honesty demands it. Suzanne Blum inherited the management of a declining woman with no English family prepared to advocate for her, no formal royal standing, no institutional protections, and a history of treatment by the British establishment that offered no reason to trust it would behave well toward her now. The French government's peppercorn lease on the villa had no guaranteed future. The archive, 40 years of correspondence, documents, and private records, had no custodian. The Duchess's affairs, financial and legal, had been managed jointly with the Duke for 35 years and now required management by someone. In the absence of any family member, any official representative, any figure appointed by the British state to look after the woman a British king had married, Blum stepped into a vacuum. Whatever her methods, Blum kept the French government from ending the villa arrangement. She maintained a household. She preserved documents that became the basis of multiple books. The Pasteur Institute received a substantial bequest. Arguments that she protected a client who could no longer protect herself aren't inherently implausible. They are, in fact, a perfectly coherent reading of the same facts that Vickers reads as exploitation. Both readings exist in the record. The film does not adjudicate between them. What the film requires is honest acknowledgement of both, and honest acknowledgement of the conditions in which the question arises. Wallis Simpson lost her ability to speak by approximately 1980. This is confirmed across multiple independent sources, including Wikipedia's biographical entry and contemporaneous press reporting at the time of her death. The path to that silence had been building since 1972. Arteriosclerosis was already contributing to mental confusion at the time of Edward's death. Dementia followed, progressing through the mid-1970s. Multiple strokes. Rheumatoid arthritis so severe that her hands were deformed beyond the point at which she could wear her wedding ring. At least 2 documented hip fractures, the first over Christmas 1972, another later. By approximately November 1975, she was too ill to travel. By 1978, In accounts derived from Vickers's access to staff testimony, she had ceased to speak. By 1980, she was confined to bed entirely, dependent on nursing staff to move her. In 1982, Blum appeared on the BBC's Time Watch program and told the camera, "For 7 years now, she has been bedridden, being only able to be taken to an armchair in front of the windows to look at the trees and to hear the birds sing." 7 years from 1982 places the onset of complete bedridden status at approximately 1975, consistent with the travel records but considerably earlier than the 1980 date given in other accounts. The gap between these timelines matters, because it's the gap in which the most consequential legal arrangements were made. The Duchess's physician, Elvia Goen, described her to those who gained access as effectively a prisoner in her own home. A visitor who managed to see her near the end, identified only as a baron in Blackwood's account, described a figure in the bed reduced to less than half her former weight, apparently unconscious, her skin darkened, her hands curled. UPI's Wire report filed on the day of her death, April 24, 1986, described her as a lonely, bedridden recluse whose neighbors couldn't remember the last time they had seen her. Caroline Blackwood's account of what it took simply to reach Wallis is, in itself, a document of the gatekeeping. Blackwood was commissioned by the British Sunday Times around 1980 to interview the Duchess. She was never allowed to see her. She was blocked at Blum. Blum offered contradictory accounts of Wallis's condition across their encounters, sometimes in a coma, sometimes in a different conversation, sitting in a chair by the window, animatedly chatting and listening to Cole Porter records. Blackwood wrote the book about what she found, and what she was told, and what she was denied. Blum threatened legal action. The manuscript sat unpublished for 15 years. The Last of the Duchess appeared in English in 1995, 1 year after Blum died. The ethical weight of those final years rests on a question the record can't cleanly answer. At the moments when the most consequential legal arrangements were made, in 1972, in 1973, during the hospitalization, in the mid-1970s as authority consolidated, was Wallis Simpson capable of meaningful consent? Did she understand what she was agreeing to? Did she choose it? The biographers who have worked most extensively with this material suggest she was already in marked physical and mental decline by the mid-1970s, and that by the time the most contested transactions occurred, she was vulnerable, isolated, and possibly unable to fully oversee the legal arrangements made in her name. No independent verification of her mental state at the decisive moments has surfaced in accessible sources. The absence of that verification isn't proof of anything, it's simply the absence. What makes the silence of those years more striking is the silence that preceded them. Wallis Simpson had spent 5 decades refusing to speak about her private life in any direct sense. She published one memoir in 1956. The Heart Has Its Reasons told the story of her early years, her marriages, and the abdication in the most carefully managed tones. Biographers consistently describe it as deliberately omitting her actual feelings about what happened. No private accounting of whether she had wanted the abdication, no assessment of what exile had cost her, no honest reckoning with the architecture of the life that followed December 1936. It reads, in retrospect, as the work of a woman who understood that certain things can't be taken back once said, and who had made a calculation about which things were better left unsaid. The memoir was ghostwritten, carefully edited, and released into a world that had already made up its mind about her. Whatever she felt about the choice that defined her life, The Heart Has Its Reasons wasn't where those feelings went. She specified nothing. She named no regret. She offered no sentence that could be clipped and used against her. Across 50 years of public exposure, interviews, profiles, parties attended by the elite of European society and the American press, she maintained the position. Her private life wasn't a subject. Her feelings about the abdication weren't available. The shape of the interior remained unshared. That silence was never entirely free. The palace's expectations of discretion from exiled royals weren't advisory. A woman who had spent decades navigating the hostile attention of the British establishment understood what happened to those who spoke out of turn. But the silence was also, at least in part, her own construction. A deliberate choice not to give her enemies the ammunition they had been waiting for since 1936. The correspondence she preserved told a different story. She kept it for a reason, and she kept it for a specific purpose. Multiple review sources confirm that the letters were preserved with the Duchess's expressed wish that they be published after her death, as her final answer to speculation about the relationship. She wouldn't speak while she was alive to be questioned. She arranged for the record to speak after. In 1986, the same year Wallis died, Michael Bloch published what quickly became a bestseller on both sides of the Atlantic. Its full title was Wallis and Edward, Letters, 1931 to 1937, The Intimate Correspondence of the Duke and Duchess of Windsor. Published in the United Kingdom by Weidenfeld and Nicholson, and in the United States by Summit Books, a Simon & Schuster imprint, the volume covered the correspondence from their first meeting in January 1931 through their wedding at Château de Condé on June 3, 1937. It also included, according to reviews, Wallis's diary of the affair in the form of weekly letters to her aunt in Washington, a running private account of the relationship written in real time as the crisis was developing. Blum released the letters after the Duchess's death, stating it was the expressed wish of the Duchess that they be published posthumously as her final answer to speculation. The Independent's obituary of Blum noted she acknowledged profiting from royalties for her time and assistance in the volume's production. Two things must be held at the same time about this publication. First, the letters were, in one sense, exactly what Wallis had arranged: her posthumous voice, the private record speaking from the archive she had preserved and instructed to be released. Second, the editor who shaped the volume, Michael Bloch, had worked as Blum's assistant since 1979. He wasn't an independent scholar who had stumbled on the material. He was, in the New Yorker's 1991 description, the figure Blum appointed to present the case for the defense, and gave full and exclusive access to the Windsor archive. The letters are the record, but their selection, framing, and editorial apparatus weren't entirely Wallis's. Bloch's editorial notes and introduction, as described in reviews, emphasized what multiple sources characterize as mother and son dynamics: Wallis's reluctance about queenship, the complexity and negotiated quality of the love, the evidence of a woman who wasn't, as the palace's narrative required, an ambitious schemer who pursued a king. The reviews of the American edition in the Chicago Tribune and the New York Times, cited in subsequent scholarship, both noted the correspondence's portrait of a complicated, reluctant woman. The line Blum had already deployed publicly in 1978 sits at the center of this reading. In that year, attacking an ITV dramatization called Edward and Mrs. Simpson that she felt misrepresented the Duchess, Blum publicly quoted a letter from Wallis to the king during the abdication crisis. The letter read, "Give up this mad idea. It's impossible. It will be a disaster." She said this to a king who didn't listen. He signed the instrument of abdication on December 10, 1936, in the presence of his 3 surviving brothers. He left Britain for Austria that night, and on June 3, 1937, at Château de Condé in the Loire Valley, Wallis married him. In a Wallis blue dress, Mainbacher had dyed to match the walls of the chateau, a color that became known afterward by her name. She had told him not to. He had done it anyway. And she had spent the next 35 years living with what he had done. 25 years after Bloch's edition appeared, a second set of letters surfaced from a different archive entirely. In 2011, biographer Anne Seba found, in a private collection whose location she described only as previously unknown, a cache of letters from Wallis to her second husband, Ernest Simpson. The envelopes were postmarked 1936 to 1937, written during Wallis's divorce from Ernest and the height of the abdication crisis, the precise months when everything was happening and nothing could be said. Ernest had kept them. They weren't in the Blum-controlled Windsor archive. They had survived outside the entire apparatus of gatekeeping, in the possession of the man Wallis had left behind. Seba, in her article about the discovery, titled Wallis Simpson and the Secret Letters, How the Discovery of a New Archive Rewrites History, described what she found. The letters showed Wallis, in those months after October 1936, as a woman drowning, thrashing around and blaming everyone and everything. One passage she documented directly. "I think of us so much, though I try not to." Wallis wrote about having a good side and bad side that were always at war. Further accounts of the same correspondence note she wrote that Edward must not abdicate to marry her, and that she wanted to be with Ernest. These letters weren't released by Blum. They weren't curated by Bloch. They emerged from outside the system of controlled disclosure that had governed the Windsor archive for decades. They aren't the record Blum chose to make available. They are the record that survived her because it was never hers to keep. Together, the 1986 letters and the 2011 letters produce a portrait of a woman who told a king his plan was impossible, who continued to write to her abandoned husband about missing him, who entered a marriage that began in exile and never escaped it, whose life from 1937 to 1972 was organized entirely around an act she had tried to prevent. What the abdication correspondence and the Ernest letters jointly suggest, not prove, but suggest, and the distinction matters, is a woman considerably more complicated than either the palace's scheming temptress or the simple romantic heroine that later sympathetic accounts preferred. Some who have read those letters carefully, and the biographies built on them, have reached a hard conclusion: that she wanted to go, that she tried to go, and that Edward's refusal to let her go, his absolute, declared intention to abdicate if she wouldn't stay, left her in a position where staying was the only path available. That she chose him in the end, not as an act of love, but as an act of resignation to an outcome she could no longer prevent. The specific historical evidence that comes closest to supporting this reading isn't a single dramatic sentence, but an accumulation. Her letter saying it would be a disaster, her letters to Ernest expressing loss, the pattern across correspondence of a woman who kept trying to redirect a catastrophe and kept failing. The palace's story required her to be the pursuer. Every narrative that made her the schemer, the ambitious gold digger who had set out to catch a king, required the abdication to be her desire. The letters complicate that story almost beyond recovery. Whether they fully demolish, it's another question. The same correspondence shows genuine affection. Bloch's editorial reading, mother and son dynamics, mutual dependence, negotiated love, finds real material in the letters too. Biographers who have spent careers on this question don't agree. The slightly foxed review of Vickers's book states that he makes it clear that Mrs. Simpson didn't lure the king from the throne. The Guardian's review of the same book found Wallis, even in the Vickers reading, not attractive. A self-interested, calculating woman rather than a simple victim. People are more than one thing. Letters can carry more than one reading because the people who wrote them were living in more than one register at once, strategic and genuine, frightened and determined, in love and in retreat. What the letters can't be is denied. They exist. They were released only after Wallis died, because during her life, first the palace and then the lawyer held the doors. When those doors finally opened, the audience that read the correspondence drew its own conclusions. The reading that emerged most persistently, that she tried to stop it, that she stayed only because she couldn't leave, is one the evidence will bear, even if the evidence also bears alternatives. In the weeks immediately following Wallis's death on April 24, 1986, bronchial pneumonia, with underlying cardiovascular disease, at the address she had occupied since the early 1950s, the business of the estate moved quickly. On May 1st, 1 week after she died, Suzanne Blum announced to the Los Angeles Times that the Pasteur Institute in Paris would be the primary beneficiary of the Duchess's fortune, including the jewels that had been one of the defining visual features of her public persona for 50 years. Blum stated the Duchess had made this bequest 12 years earlier, placing it around 1974, at a point when Wallis was already in significant cognitive and physical decline, with the condition that none of the funds be directed toward research involving vivisection. Wallis Simpson had no documented prior connection to the Pasteur Institute. She had shown limited interest in charitable giving across her adult life. The bequest therefore requires explanation, and the competing explanations remain in dispute. Vickers' version is documented in detail in Behind Closed Doors. Blum told the Duchess that the French government would expel her from the villa unless she bequeathed her estate to French beneficiaries. He further alleges that a lawyer and a doctor who traveled to the villa specifically to help the Duchess revise her will, to redirect it away from the Pasteur Institute, were refused entry by Blum. These are attributed allegations. They haven't been tested in court. They haven't been refuted by any published counter-account. The May 1986 announcement made Blum the public face of the Windsor estate. From that position, she managed the archive, the correspondence, the ongoing publication arrangements, including the letters Bloch had edited, and the legal aftermath of the Duchess's death. Mohammed Al-Fayed acquired the lease of the villa from French authorities in 1986, following Wallis's death. This is a legally distinct transaction from anything that occurred under Blum's authority during Wallis's lifetime. Al-Fayed purchased from the city of Paris, not from Blum, and the distinction matters for anyone trying to follow the legal chain of custody. He reportedly spent approximately £10 million restoring the property and created a Windsor museum within the house, exhibiting furniture and memorabilia associated with the couple. In September 1997, Sotheby's New York held sale number 7000, the property from the collection of the Duke and Duchess of Windsor, running September 11th through 19th. The abdication desk went under the hammer. Albums of photographs, furniture, the material record of a life organized around one morning in December 1936. Suzanne Blum died in Paris on January 23, 1994. She was 95 years old, 4 years younger than the century she had almost entirely inhabited. She had outlived Wallis by nearly 8 years, despite being 2 years her junior. She had outlived the Duke by 22 years. She had, by the time she died, outlived the capacity of anyone to challenge her in a forum where she could respond. Hugo Vickers published Behind Closed Doors in 2011, 17 years after Blum died, and therefore 17 years after the only person who could have mounted a substantive rebuttal lost the capacity to do so. This isn't an accusation. It's a structural fact about the record, and it shapes how the book must be handled. The account is detailed, specific, 40 years in the making, and built from diary entries, unpublished papers, and staff testimony. It can't be cross-examined. What it can be is read carefully, cited precisely, and attributed, as this account attempts to its author rather than to settled fact. April 29, 1986. St. George's Chapel, Windsor Castle. The institution that had spent 50 years refusing to grant Wallis Simpson the style of Royal Highness, the title Edward had fought for, the title his brother denied her by letters patent supported unanimously by the Dominion governments in 1937, gave her 28 minutes. A private service. The Dean acknowledged her once, in a prayer. Queen Elizabeth was there. The Queen Mother, who had blamed Wallis, according to multiple accounts, for the early death of her husband, King George VI, the man who inherited a throne he had not prepared for and whose health broke under the weight of it. The Prince and Princess of Wales, Princess Anne. They carried her in an English oak coffin with a silver plaque reading, Wallis, Duchess of Windsor, 1896 to 1986, and buried her at the Royal Burial Ground at Frogmore, Windsor, in the grave they had agreed with Edward in 1970. The Queen had written to the Duke in the summer of that year confirming the arrangement. He had written back, "This has naturally pleased and comforted us very much." He wasn't alive to see it executed. The institution's final accounting of the woman it had spent 50 years managing was, in the end, 28 minutes and one prayer. The same establishment that had fought to deny her the HRH had arranged, at least, to bury her beside the man she had married at the cost of his crown and her freedom. The symmetry of it, buried together at Windsor, in the shadow of the castle whose monarch had refused them both entry for decades, is the kind of symmetry history produces not by design, but by the accumulation of decisions made across decades by people who didn't know they were building toward it. The woman who had been photographed in Vogue 8 times by 1938, dressed by Mainbochet and Givenchy and Chanel, who had presided over parties at which the elite of European aristocracy competed for invitations, received her final public ceremony in a chapel she had never been allowed to enter while alive as a welcome guest. 28 minutes, one prayer, then silence. The butler kept the first secret, and he kept it for half a century. The lawyer kept the last one, and she kept it with keys. Between them stands a woman who outlived a king by 14 years, in a house built around a correspondence, behind doors that opened for fewer and fewer faces, while the things she owned quietly left the building one by one. Wallis Simpson spent 5 decades refusing to tell her story. In the end, the story was told anyway, by the letters she left, released only when she could no longer be questioned about them. She was the most famous prisoner the palace ever produced. It's only fitting that we finally say what the locks were for, not to keep the world out, to keep her in. If you want more stories like this one, subscribe